very much for hosting me. Just to elaborate a little on my interests here, I am doing a PhD in plant ecology, funnily enough, so you might think, well, what the hell is he standing up here talking about? All this evolutionary psychology stuff, or what might he possibly know about that? Well, I've sort of developed a second career for myself as an evolutionary psychologist / intelligence researcher, which has been a sort of productive diversion from plant sciences, which really isn't all that interesting. No offence to any plant scientists amongst you, but it really isn't. Okay, so I want to talk a little about a theory that I've been developing and published one or two papers on, concerning this thing called Clever-sillies, which I think might be relevant to this whole issue of existential risk and things that might bugger up the singularity, based on human nature. This resonates to an extent with some of the talks that were given earlier, about existential angst and the origins of this sort of mismatch between human expectations and where we're going in terms of cultural evolution. So, really I want to start off by defining what I mean by clever-silly. Well, a clever-silly really describes a sort of type of person characteristic of modernity. And they're typically people who have very high intelligence, but they tend to lack what could be termed common sense, or some people might term it social intelligence, although I dispute that. These people tend to hold sort of left-wing and progressive views. They tend to gravitate towards knowledge work fields. They tend to be very sort of modish, and they run with crowds, and they're very fashionable type people, and they sort of set the normative centre of gravity for much of Western modernity for the last sort of 50 or 60 years. They're predominantly baby boomers as well. It's not to say there weren't clever-sillies that predated them, it's just there are some specific cultural traits which sort of differentiate contemporary clever-sillies from clever-sillies of yore. So there are really two definitions in the literature of what a clever-silly is in terms of dissecting them and determining what sort of makes them tick in terms of the psychological traits that characterise them. The first one was put forward by a guy called Bruce Charlton back in 2009. And he basically defines clever-sillies as individuals possessing high IQs plus high openness to experience, which is one of the big 5 personality traits associated with sort of intellect and curiosity and things like that. His argument is that they use this openness to experience to essentially override their sort of evolved predispositions towards common sense. So, as a consequence of that, they come to embrace what could be termed evolutionarily novel ideas. So, like I mentioned earlier, they're predominantly progressive or leftist. Sometimes they're libertarians. You do find them on the right as well. They tend to be very atheistic or secular. They're irreligious. And again, the argument is that humans have sort of evolved predispositions to be in some ways the opposite of this, and they've managed to find ways of overriding this with their openness to experience. So Charlton argues that they have low social intelligence, that this is not a socially intelligent thing because it's maladaptive. He argues that this gives rise... His thesis is that modernity is essentially maladaptive. I want to elaborate a little on that later, but my own definition of clever-sillies, I believe they're a real phenomenon. They represent a real component of the population. But my argument is that they're slightly different. They're high IQ, but they have their capacity to sort of override implicit predispositions comes from this thing called effortful control. There's this divide in psychology between what's called explicit and implicit processing. So implicit processing is associated with sort of these evolved modules that are instinctual, essentially, and explicit processing is the sort of the executive processes that control and coordinate the outputs of those modules. So I argue that it's because they have this high capacity for effortful control that they're actually capable of overriding implicit predispositions. And also I'm a little bit cynical about them. I think that they're very Machiavellian people as well. They can sort of adapt to any particular political norms. There'll be correlations between IQ, for example, and political leftism. But those only hold true in contemporary societies where the normative centre of gravity is post-materialist. I've got evidence that if you go to places like South Africa in the 80s or Britain in the 50s, higher IQ people actually tended to be more right-wing. So these people will they will embrace the political attitudes that will advance them further, and in doing so they'll come to, they're sort of chameleonic. And I argue that this is sort of the essence of social intelligence. So my argument is that these people are very highly socially intelligent, but that they can come to believe weird things. especially if there are social advantages to be had in believing and promulgating weird things. So what this boils down to really is that, irrespective of how you look at clever-sillies, in both cases they lack what could be broadly described as rationality. And I want to elaborate a little, because rationality concerns the use of reason and logic in the pursuit of goals and the development of worldviews. There is a thing called dysrationalia, which was proposed by Stanovich in 1993 as a learning disability, which is based on the idea that, again, this is again associated with the clever-silly phenomena. There are high IQ people who just cannot, under any circumstances, embrace logically consistent ways of thinking or worldviews. They are irrational for whatever reason. And you do, like I say, smart people get into sort of weird and discredited things, like astrology, the New Age God, and certain forms of socialism. And libertarianism as well. Certain species of libertarianism would definitely count as clever-silly as well, so I'm not sort of victim of picking on one side of the political spectrum. I think silliness is to be found on all wings of the political spectrum. So really what we need to do is draw an important distinction here between two forms of rationality, if we want to get into what rationality is. I call the first type proximate rationality. It basically concerns the sort of rational calculus that rational agents are meant to be able to engage in, the sort of thing that economists talk about when they endorse rational choice theory. So it's utility maximizing behaviours through reciprocal exchanges of goods, services, money, that kind of thing. Humans are really very bad at behaving like economists want them to. We're really terrible. A lot of rational choice theory just does not match onto the reality of what humans do at the end of the day. It's only predictive at the aggregate level. At finer scales, it just falls apart. So, like I say, humans believe weird and irrational things, and this frustrates economists who continually try to use rational choice theory to explain and understand this. But I'd argue that we don't need to toss rationality out completely as a sort of a model for understanding the way humans define, set and approach goals. Or the methods through which they're using, the consistency of the methods in which we're using approaching those things, because I think we can talk about a type of rationality which I call ultimate rationality, and this basically, this explains the rational core of why people embrace irrational belief systems, because it concerns the evolutionary calculus of those beliefs. So evolution, as an evolutionary psychologist and as an evolutionist period, I believe that evolution shaped and continues to shape human behaviour. I don't believe that humans are in any way an exception to that. So as a consequence of that, there are heritable predispositions which shape those beliefs, which are shaped by evolution. So ultimate rationality basically suggests that these beliefs may actually be fitness enhancing, even though at the proximate level they're not rational. So example one, religiosity, it can instill irrational beliefs, and here's our creationist on his sort of the right place for him in the march of progress. And it can lead to irrational outcomes, fundamentalism, creationism, warfare, and even terrorism. But on the other hand, religiosity can actually create a sense of community, in-group altruism. It also protects against pathogens, believe it or not. If anyone has any questions about that, I'll address them in the questions session, but there is evidence for that. So religiosity is likely, therefore, evolutionarily advantageous to our ancestors. And it might still, therefore, be to many people living in pathogen-rich areas. So socialism, radical socialism, killed 100 million people in the 20th century. Yet it persists as a very popular belief system, especially amongst the younger people. So why might socialism still be appealing to people despite its failures in the past? The same reason that religion appeals to people, because at some point in our past, being socialistic, i.e. having no food surpluses, engaging in spontaneous altruism, was the norm for human behaviour, especially in hunter-gatherer societies. However, in those societies, there were strict controls to prevent cheating of the sort which you simply can't build into modern societies. So those controls basically usually result in totalitarian type social engineering, which is no good for anyone at the end of the day, but they work on a small scale amongst highly closely related members of the tribe. So hence it was normal for humans to be socialist essentially in the past.